Okay, we got a rock flat. Brenda, let's turn into it. Again, the flat.
Half-wedge is pink, yeah, possible bad at 058, bullseye, received.
Brenda, pod zone. I don't see that fucker. I don't either.
Brenda, 83 is going to turn eastbound. I lost you in that green.
Okay, Brenda, let's reverse course back to east. Full jet. 060, 40 nautical.
Brenda, 1 knot. That will be on your 167 and 8. Possible 167 and 8.
Copy that.
Okay, 10,000 power. There's Brenda 4. Copy, thanks out. Brenda, you're on the dark band at 444, bullseye 14.
Roger.
Brenda 4, copy, blower.
Red ground, Brenda 1. Where's the bandit?
Brenda 2 is bingo. Stand by, you're in the dark, estimating.
Okay, give me egress heading.
We got friendlies out there to the left, boys. Brenda's 1, estimating about at 039. Brenda 2 is bingo.
Okay, 2. Let's plug out.
Brenda 4, get up the wing here, one of us.
Turn pod off. Pod off.
It's off.
Off, I mean.
It's off. We need about a 090.
Okay.
100.
100.
Brenda 4 is bingo. Okay, and Brenda just stay line up, pull up the right. Brenda 4. Take it around to the right. Jay, check my 6 o'clock back there.
Roger, we have 12 doors one back there.
All right. Brenda 4, move up the line up.
Okay, Fletch, Brenda's coming out.
All right, we're on station. Move it out about 1,000 feet, Brenda 4.
Thanks, Fletch, up the line, 1 line.
Tuesday.
Roger. Okay, I've got a MiG-21 in our 3 o'clock low down there, Brenda 2, cross to the other wing. He may try to pop up on us. We got 95 fuel.
Roger.
Okay, I'm going to take one quick run at him, 2. You continue on out.
I'll stay with you. Brenda 1 out. Low light 1 was up. Brenda exiting the area.
Negative. Brenda 1's on a MiG-19.
See? Higher.
Give me 5 mile bore side.
Take it to the right again. Roll 3. Roger.
You got it.
Hollow 2 is on.
Copy, there it goes.
4. 2.
Okay, I'm going heat.
Okay. Stand line ballistically.
Say again.
Same position, 4.
Down. Gun.
Okay.
He's going down. You got him? Yeah. I got him. He left the ground. All right, go there. Let's get out of here.
There we go.
I got him. Let's get out of here. Give me a fucking shot, too, baby. Okay, go, baby.
Let's get out of here, Brenda. He's closing at 6 right now.
Well, hello there. Today's video will be a telling of 2 stories. The first story will be a tale of an air crew in the throes of combat, overcoming technical adversity to effect victory in the skies over North Vietnam. And the second story will be about the model in question from HobbyMaster. So let us begin. In last week's video, we reviewed the F-4D in the 555th Fighter Squadron colors. Multiple pilots in that aircraft's career scored a grand total of 6 MiG kills with it. And those of you who are subscribers to my channel may have noticed that we didn't talk very much about how that airplane got those kills. And that's because this week we're going to touch a little bit on how Air Force Aircraft Dash 463, as reviewed last week, got a couple of those kills, and how that story ties into the F-4E you see depicted here now. So on May 10th, 1972, Oyster 02 was a flight lead flying over North Vietnam. Oyster 02 was crewed by Major Robert Lodge flying as the pilot, and Wizzo Captain Roger Locker in the back working the radar and electronic combat systems. On May 10th's engagement, the North Vietnamese sent up multiple Chinese-built MiG-19 derivatives called J6s. Incidentally, I did review Panzer Kampf's model of that MiG, so if you want to check out my video on that, feel free to look on my channel. But returning to the events of May 10th, Major Robert Lodge was flying the Oyster 02 F-4D while preoccupied with locking up and shooting down a MiG-21 with the Sparrow missile, he was himself shot down by a MiG-19 via 30mm cannon. The F-4 in question was on fire and in a flat spin when the Wizzo, Captain Roger Locker, ejected. Major Lodge apparently stayed with the airplane deliberately, riding it down until his death in the crash. The reason for his decision to do this was a pragmatic one. Major Robert Lodge was the tactics officer for the 555th and knew a lot of classified details on the F-4D's capabilities, including American tactics, technology, and implementation of the then classified combat tree identification friend or foe spoofing system. The combat tree allowed the U.S. Air Force to get kills on MiG-21s and MiG-19s from well beyond visual range, and had that technology been compromised by Major Lodge's torture at the hands of the North Vietnamese, it would have, of course, damaged American interests and capabilities substantially, a fact that Robert Lodge knew all too well. And so he sacrificed himself and declared that intention well before he was shot down over North Vietnam, and followed through to the letter, leaving his Wizzo, Captain Roger Locker, the only survivor of Oyster 02 shoot-down. After Roger Locker was shot down, he knew from pre-briefings that rescue north of the Red River, which is where he was operating at the time, would not be possible due to enemy capabilities, which meant Locker immediately made plans to make his way south past the Red River so that he could position himself better for extraction. This escape and evasion process spanned a period of 44 days in North Vietnam, representing the longest period of time to that extent of a U.S. Air Force crew member evading capture over that period of time. The 555th had, not incorrectly, probably assumed that with the crash of the F-4, he had probably died along with his flight lead or his pilot, and therefore considered Captain Locker lost in action. It wasn't until at the end of those 44 days when Captain Locker pulled out his survival radio and contacted a flight of F-4s doing a mission locally that they realized that he had indeed survived and needed, in Roger Locker's words, a ride out of there. So fortunately for Locker, also, the flight lead for the second engagement was a certain Captain Steve Ritchie, who had also flown on May 10th when Oyster 02 was shot down. So he recognized Locker on the radio and brought word of that information to U.S. Air Force headquarters when he returned to land. The 7th Air Force headquarters in Saigon got word that they had a man on the ground in North Vietnam who needed extraction after 44 days on the run. The commanding officer of the 7th Air Force, a 2-star general, immediately issued a stop command on all scheduled Air Force operations and immediately mobilized every aircraft in the theater to assist in the various flights and operations needed to help get Roger Locker out of North Vietnam, a mission which was ultimately successful. And part of the operations which helped enable that successful rescue of Captain Locker was a flight flown as Brenda 02. On this day, Brenda 02 was an F-4E flown by the 58th Tactical Fighter Squadron and operated under the command of the pilot Phil Hans Handley and Wizzo Captain Smallwood. So this team would go on to shoot down a MiG-19 in the course of the rescue of Roger Locker. So there is the connection between the F-4, which we reviewed last week, that flew on May 10th and scored 2 MiG kills on that day, and the F-4E we see here, once again from HobbyMaster, which flew on the day of Roger Locker's rescue, stemming from that day's events and engagement. So the MiG-19s that were flown on that day were fairly formidable aircraft. They were bought by the North Vietnamese to replace the, at this point, very elderly MiG-17s. We have to remember by 1972, the MiG-17 was hopelessly obsolete even by North Vietnamese standards, and the J-6s were thus imported to take the place of the retired MiG-17s. Well, the MiG-19s did not feature a lot in the way of technology. They did feature superior acceleration to the F-4 in certain low-altitude regimes and had 30mm cannons, both of which were used to good effect against the F-4Ds on May 10th. So this was a fairly formidable opponent, and going up against one in a Phantom was not a light proposition. However, this is exactly what the crew of Brenda 02 did on the day of the MiG kill, which you see on the nose of this aircraft. So to break down the engagement, the cockpit tape is in the introduction of this video, so if you want to step back and go check it out, I definitely wouldn't suggest otherwise. But here is what happens on the engagement in question, and it's careful to note here that what you heard in the introduction was cockpit footage of the real thing, once again. And I say this because when it comes to debates about technology and capability and everything, lots of people like to quote statistics and analysis and data and so forth. But there's no substitute for somebody on the ground being on scene, fighting, flying with the equipment at hand. There's nothing that can beat combat events, and we see this borne out with Brenda 02's engagement. So breaking it down at 4 minutes and 7 seconds into the footage, Hans calls a 5-mile bore sight to lock the radar onto the MiG-19. So after the position calls were made, by having the radar in a bore sight mode, this locks the radar to essentially face forward. So instead of the radar moving back and forth in its, I believe, 30 degrees left and right arc, the radar is fixed in the forward position alongside the axis of the aircraft. And so anything within 5 miles will have the maximum radar return, which will, of course, enable the radar-guided AIM-7 Sparrows to have the most accurate data before they come off of the launch rails of the aircraft. At this point in the fight, the aircraft was under G-forces, and Wizzo Jack Smallwood was actually blind from the G-force effects. Those of you who have seen Top Gun Maverick are at least somewhat familiar with what can happen to your eyesight when you are under high G conditions. But nevertheless, Wizzo Smallwood was able to flip the appropriate switches and make the appropriate actions to get the radar to go into bore sight mode without being able to see what he was doing. So top-notch teamwork and crew coordination right there, as it is. At 4:23, Phil Hans Handley ripple fires 2 of his AIM-7 Sparrows. On the day of the engagement, his F-4 would have had 2 AIM-7s, one that you see here, another one on the left backside of the aircraft, And the forward rails would have been taken by 2 ECM pods, one of which is not included because HobbyMaster did not have it. We'll get to that a little bit later in the review. And the ALQ-101, which you see depicted here on the front right cheek station under the intake. So by ripple firing 2 of his AIM-7 missiles, Smallwood hopes to use his BVR capability in the radar-guided missiles to effect a kill on the MiG-19. This hope was in vain. Both of the AIM-7s failed to make the kill. One falls off the aircraft and fails to fire. And understand that when these AIM-7s are launched, they actually are dropped before the rocket motor is fired. And this is done to ensure that the rocket motor doesn't damage the launching aircraft from hot exhaust coming out the back. Now, normally when the missile is launched, after it comes off the rails and the rocket comes forward, the missile then begins its sequence to start guiding. And unfortunately, the rocket motor does not fire on the first AIM-7, so it simply falls off the airplane, essentially doing an imitation of a glide bomb. The other one does come off the launch rail, falls and fires. However, it fails to guide and goes ballistic and launches straight up into the atmosphere. Recognizing from his wingman's call that both of his missile launches have failed, Hans switches to the AIM-4s, his heat-seeking missiles. On the day of the engagement, he had AIM-4 Falcons, which you see here depicted on the forward stations, one on the inside, one on the bottom. These AIM-4 Falcons are a bit of a story in and of themselves, and it's a story of politics, woe, and why the people on the pointy end of the stick sometimes get the short end of things. This is because, to summarize a very long story, in essence, there was a dispute between the Air Force and the Navy on what the next Sidewinder missile would look like. And this bureaucratic feud was intensified because while the Air Force flew the F-4 and the Navy flew the F-4, the purview of the AIM-9 Sidewinder was, and actually is to this day through the AIM-9X program, a program operated by the U.S. Navy. So the Air Force generals were not happy about being second fiddle on a missile program for their airplane. So as an act of perhaps political defiance, the U.S. Air Force specified in 1963 that they were going to move to the AIM-4. Now, this missile was never intended to be used as the combat weapon that it did in Southeast Asia. The AIM-4 was part of a program initiated in 1948 to develop an intercept missile which would shoot down Soviet bombers. And the idea was, in a head-on engagement with a fleet of Soviet Tu-95s coming over the North Pole to lay nuclear Armageddon on North America, Air Force interceptor planes like the F-102, F-101, F-106 would engage these Soviet bombers head-on and would launch weapons to stop them. And when you have a Soviet bomber flying at high, not quite Mach 1, but fairly close to it for a turboprop, 500, 600 knots at altitude, and you have a interceptor aircraft moving above the speed of sound to get to these bombers as quickly as possible, guns were not going to work. There simply wouldn't have been enough time for a human pilot to call up a gun sight, acquire the target, and then shoot without putting themselves in a position of being hit head-on by the bomber. And even if a interceptor moving above the speed of sound, in the case of the F-102 or F-106's case, twice the speed of sound, even if something like that could happen, it's very unlikely that 20 millimeter bullets could do more than nick the paint of something as big as a Tu-95 Bear. Remember, one of these bombers carries enough nuclear material to wipe out several cities, which means it's not like World War II where you can shoot down half the bomber formation and you can consider your work done. You have to take down every single bomber or you're losing a couple of cities, right? So in the World War III nuclear bomb, nuclear war scenario of the early Cold War years, having the ability to launch a missile right at a bomber and have it impact directly to affect the maximum damage was paramount. So the AIM-4 was designed to be used with a computer system which would take the closure rate of a Tu-95 moving at 500 knots, do the math, compare it to the arrival speed of, say, an F-101 Voodoo flying at Mach 1.8 to try to effect an intercept, and it would do the math, do the computations, which is actually very ingenious use of technology for early 1950s capabilities, and the launch system would tell the pilot when to cue the missile and when to fire the AIM-4. And once the pilot pressed the launch button, the AIM-4 would be activated, cued, pre-cooled, and launched by the automatic Hughes developed, in the case of the F-101, MG-13 guidance system. So all of these steps would happen automatically once the pilot pressed the launch commit button, which meant the AIM-4 would then have the most precise guidance and cueing data to effect a hit-to-kill on an incoming Soviet bomber. And the reason I'm going down this AIM-4 Air Defense Command rabbit hole is partly because I like the F-101 Voodoo, which preceded the F-4 and informed on many of its design decisions, like the angled tailplane that you see back here. But the other reason I've gone down that rabbit hole is to explain why the AIM-4, which you see here on the rails as well, did not perform as well in Southeast Asia. Put simply, it was a square peg trying to be forced into a round hole. It was never designed to be used against small, lightweight, Soviet-built MiGs. It was designed to be used against large, huge bombers, hence the hit-to-kill aspect of the weapon. Now, hit-to-kill is desirable when you want to shoot down a massive nuclear-armed bomber on the first pass. It is not desirable when you want to shoot a small, nimble, lightweight little fighter like a MiG-19. And the challenges of trying to use a sniper rifle in the phone booth situation of Southeast Asia meant that the AIM-4 had no possible chance of success in that situation, as Robin Olds and many others who tried to use the missile bore out. And unfortunately, the square peg round hole problem was further reinforced by Phil Handley's efforts on this engagement, because he launches all of his AIM-4 Falcons against the Chinese-built MiG-19 J6 derivative, and not one hits. One stays on the launch rail and doesn't launch at all. The other one misses completely and goes ballistic, just like the AIM-7s that he launched earlier. This leaves the crew of Brenda 02 with exactly one option to take out the MiG left, and that's the 20mm Vulcan cannon. At 4 minutes and 41 seconds into the tape, Hands fires his 20mm Vulcan internal cannon in front of the MiG-19. By using deflection angle shooting, the MiG-19 flies into the bullets, and the MiG-19 is shot down. And this is a great point to talk about the 20mm cannon on the F-4 and why it was built into the F-4E. So in earlier variants, which you might have seen in last week's video, the F-4D has a much shorter nose here. And the reason for this is because originally the F-4 was not designed with a built-in gun. It originally was going to have 20mm cannon, and then it was dropped because it was thought in the 1950s and 60s that guns were obsolete. As actions over North Vietnam and South Vietnam would prove, this was a premature assessment. And in 1964, as the engagements happened in Vietnam, McDonnell Douglas began an internal effort to see if they could build a 20mm cannon into the aircraft. Now, why is it that they would build a cannon into the F-4E when earlier variants, like the F-4C and the F-4D, had gun pods on the bottom? Well, the problem with using a gun pod on an airplane is that it's inherently inaccurate, because you're taking 20mm cannon fire and you are channeling the recoil of thousands of rounds of 20mm through a little pylon mount, which, while substantial enough in terms of what the airplane is built to do, is just simply not designed to handle the recoil and twisting forces of a cannon shooting bullets at 4,000, 2,000, 3,000 rounds a minute. So what happens is when you try to shoot a 20mm cannon, you're just not going to hit much. You basically have to do Kentucky windage, because there's no way to zero it against the airplane because the pylon is flexing too much during the firing sequence, which meant getting a kill with an air-to-air aircraft using a cannon pod was a very tricky business. You basically had to just shoot do Kentucky windage, shoot some more, and hope that your deflection shots were going to actually do anything. And this is one of the reasons why Robin Nold initially opposed using cannons on his F4s. He changed his mind later, but initially he felt that there just wasn't enough air-to-air deflection training for people to do that. I think he had a point. So to make it clear, the situation in Southeast Asia wasn't that the cannon was particularly necessary for air-to-air kills. It was mostly used for ground and troops in contact situations, which were the bread and butter of most of the Vietnam missions. We have to remember that for every air-to-air kill, most of the pilots in Southeast Asia would fly their 100 rotational missions and go home and not even see a MiG, much less shoot one. So using the air-to-ground mission was the primary role of the cannon, and even then it had its limitations. And it was overcoming these limitations that led to the integration of the 20mm cannon in the nose of the later F-4E, which you see here. So in the nose section, you would have the drum for the cannon. All the ammunition would be loaded basically round about here, just forward of the environmental control system intake duct here. And the cannon rounds would be fed through a link into the barrel of the cannon, which would be basically round about here. And then the shroud would guide the gun gases out and forward. Initially, before what was called the Midas 4 modifications, the gun muzzle ended right about here. And you'll actually see some of that on some of the earlier F4 models, that there isn't the extension here. It just terminates right about there. And the gun gases would go backwards towards the intakes here and then down the engine bay, and then you would get compressor stalls, which basically is a sophisticated way of saying the engine stops working. That's not a good thing when you're flying a Mach 2 supersonic fighter and you're trying to shoot something. So you want your engine to still work, and that's where the Midas 4 barrel extension is fitted here, which allows the gun gases to dissipate forward of the cannon and allows the airplane to keep flying without gun gases going down the intake and stopping the motors. This was a situation that many pilots encountered. Israeli pilots who still had the original gun muzzle on their F4 Karnasses encountered that issue, and that's something that we will potentially revisit in a later video for those of you who are tracking my hints. So coming back to Brenda 02 and the F-4E, the fitment of the cannon in the front and the APG-120 radar, APG-APQ-120 radar here, meant that while the radar was slightly less capable in the F-4E than in the earlier bullet-nosed F-4D variant, the cannon was much more accurate, because with it built into the aircraft itself, the zeroing and bore sight was much more capable, which meant now, on this day, Phil Hands Hanley could deflection shoot a MiG-19 out of the sky in a low-angle Mach 1.2 dive and effect the kill. So at 4:45 on the tape, you can also see and hear how the crews and the various other flights flying on that heady day were reacting to Hands' kill. And Hands and Smallwood definitely got no shortage of accolades for their efforts, which, let us remember, were in efforts to rescue somebody who had been on the ground in North Vietnam for 44 days. And at that point in the mission, nobody really knew that Roger Locker had been recovered by search and rescue and Sandy forces. So all in all, that was a very good day for the United States Air Force, and a very historic one for a lot of people, including Hands and Smallwood, who contributed to another MiG kill for the 58th Tactical Fighter Squadron in Southeast Asia. And it is for these historical reasons that this F-4E has joined my collection. And with that, we will discuss the HobbyMaster rendition. So the pros of the F-4E are, overall, I think the paint quality looks good. HobbyMaster chose some good colors with this release. We don't see a prevalence of unrealistic shades of either the dark green, light green, or the brown. So the stencils also that you see in the model are done really well, and they're not overly noticeable. They're toned down in such a way that they're fairly realistic to what the actual aircraft featured at the time. And the loadouts in terms of the missiles are really good, unlike last week's release where you only got the AIM-9s and the bombs on the inner wing pylons. On this release, you get the AIM-4s, which are of course realistic to what Brenda 02 had on the day of their mid-kill, and you get a set of AIM-9Js in an alternative pylon set. You also get a centerline fuel tank, which represents the old school ones where you had a 5G limit and you had to eject them below 400 knots. So all very realistic for the period, and HobbyMaster got the overall details of the F4 correct. So we have the correct gun muzzle, meaning the extended Midas 4 one, not the short one, which was the original F-4E gun mount. The wing is what's called a hard wing Phantom. So as you see here, there are no slats. If you noticed in the introductory footage, you might have seen some footage of the forward slats popping up. That is a feature of what was called the Agile Eagle modification, which enabled tighter turning rates and better turning radius for F4 so equipped at the cost of reduced top end speed. So if you notice, HobbyMaster bore that in mind and accurately rendered this 58th Tactical Fighter Squadron F-4E with the non-slat equipped boundary layer control wing. And this wing only has slats which come down in the forward position, and they're blown by compressed air from the engines to enable lower speed and more control during the landing cycle. And the tailplanes feature the correct slotted leading edge, which enables a bit better pitch angle and therefore enhances the turn rate. And it also, of course, has the updated J79 nozzles, which, the disclaimer, I did repaint and use some Tamiya wash on to get those to be more realistic color. So they won't look like that when you get this brand new out of the box, unfortunately. Which brings me to some of the drawbacks of the model. So for the negatives, the nose demarcation line here between the white on the bottom and the camouflage, I had to repaint that to match the actual airplane. When you get it out of the box, the termination of the camouflage actually is about midpoint on the nose, fairly close to the environmental control system intake nozzle here, which is essentially a sophisticated term for the airplane's air conditioner and climate control system. So this intake scoop here is basically where the this is where the demarcation line between the white on the bottom and the camouflage starts when you get the model out of the box, and that also happens to be the case right about here near the intakes. This is unfortunately not accurate to the actual airplane, so I had to take my HobbyMaster paint collection, mask that off, and redo it. So I did that on both sides. So the sections that you see here, just underneath this stencil for the front right intake, and right about here as I'm showing it with the tip of my G2 pen, all this part here was white coming out of the box. So I had to repaint that. And while not a terribly tough thing to do, it is still something I would have liked to have seen HobbyMaster get right out of the box. One of the other drawbacks are you don't get the second ECM pod, which was carried on the day of the mission. Now, of course, this airplane does feature the mid-kill mark on the nose, so obviously it's not going to be period accurate if you want to show it on the day of, because they didn't paint that before they went to shoot down a MiG-19, right? But it would have been nice to see the accurate loadout on this aircraft. The other thing that is worth noting is that you may notice there's a gap in the canopy with the canopy down. Unfortunately, it looks like the inserts probably need to be sanded down a little bit. I didn't realize that because I generally display this model on the ground with the landing gear down and the canopies open. So I didn't really mess with putting on the closed canopy that comes in the box until I went to shoot this video. And then I noticed it was a little bit cockeyed sitting in the frame. So I'm probably not going to mess with it, but just be aware that if and when you do decide to get this for your collection, you may need to take some sandpaper to get that straight. Otherwise, it's going to sit a little weird like you see in some of the shots here. And then finally, I do want to point out that the fit of some of the fit of the landing gear, the main landing gear, is actually good, but the fit of the nose gear door was extremely stiff on mine. I had to practically shove it into the slot, which is not a particularly comfortable thing to do because then it feels like you're breaking the model. So just bear in mind that you may encounter those issues if and when you do pick one of yours up. And just a note for HobbyMaster in the future, hopefully they'll think about putting a little bit more detail on the J79 engine nozzles, because out of the box they kind of have this flat gray generic appearance, and I just couldn't live with that on this one. So when I went to do the light weathering on the intakes, sides, as well as the aft tail, I also went and painted the engine nozzles titanium silver, and then went over it with some Tamiya black panel wash to give it a realistic sheen for those J79 motors, because out of the box the generic gray just wasn't sitting well with me. So that'd be something I'd like to see HobbyMaster improve, just like they did the accessory fit, which I'm glad to say that the suspended accessories such as the missiles and the ALQ 101 ECM pod, as well as the external fuel tanks, they all fit good and snug. It's not like the F-4E from last week, which if you just breathe on those wrong, they fall off the model. So good job on HobbyMaster for finally dialing that in, as well as doing that for the landing gear. So all things considered, I am very glad to have this one in my collection. And as soon as HobbyMaster announced this, this one basically went on my radar to order. And I'm glad it's here because it complements my 555th triple nickel F-4E very well. And given the historical connection between these two Southeast Asian Phantoms, I just had to have them in the mix. So hopefully you'll consider adding this one to your collection as well. As far as I'm concerned, no 1/72nd scale airplane collection is correct until there's at least one Phantom in there. And if you need to add a Southeast Asian hard-wing Phantom, this one is about as good as they come. So unlike the Air Commander offerings, which charge an arm and a leg on the secondary market, I'm glad to share that you can still get these relatively easily, and they're not, you know, $200, $300 freaking dollars almost for the Air Commander Robin Old version. I can't even recommend you buy that one because it's just so freaking expensive. Which is unfortunate because Air Commander makes really good F4s, but the HobbyMaster here, it's a pretty good mix. If you're, just bear in mind, you're probably going to have to do some paint work on the nose to get that sorted out, but $150 out the door is much better than $300 out the door. And in terms of historical relevance and all those things, Smallwood and Hands' F-4E as Brenda 02 is just as worthy of an addition to the mix as any other MiG killer Phantom that y'all can think of. So with that, we will leave the video there. Thank you for watching. Thank you for subscribing, those of you who are subscribers. And if you haven't subscribed and you like 1/72nd Air Wing or 1/72nd scale model content, feel free to check out my other videos on the 1/72nd Air Wing channel. Odds are I probably reviewed something that you're into, and if you like my content, feel free to leave a comment below, and again, consider subscribing if you haven't. That way you'll be notified when I upload my new videos each week, and you'll also, that'll be your way of telling YouTube and myself that you like what I'm doing. So thank you all once again for watching. We'll catch you in the next video.